Thank you, Pat, and thanks, everybody. It's great to be here today and to share some of the results of our monitoring program with you today. So I think this follows up very nicely on Roisin's talk there, and microplastics, and consider what might be coated on those microplastics. Maybe is a good thing to keep in mind during this presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, this is a fairly broad title, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what chemicals in particular I want to discuss with you today, how they're regulated, how they're managed, a little bit on that, but really what I want to show you is some of the monitoring results that we have got over the last number of years. In last year's Water Quality in Ireland report, we had a chapter there on chemical status, and we published some of this data, so I'm going to show some of it to you today, and I'm going to focus in on a couple of chemicals. I'll be interchanging chemicals and substance, those words during this presentation, but I'm going to be focusing in on a couple of substances that we started monitoring for in 2019, and they've been showing up, and we kind of expected to see them, and they are indeed there. And I'm going to then, at the end, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what else is going on in this space, what's happening here next in this area. So I'll try and move it on. So as we all know, since the 1950s, there's been great advances in synthetic chemistry, and we're all now living longer, healthier, and more comfortable lives. And that's due to fantastic advances in food production, in medicine, consumer goods, and and that's been, I think we'll all agree, it's been that's been great. But unfortunately, there's been some unintended impacts from some of these synthetic chemicals, and so things like DDT, which is one of the first insecticides that was produced, that turned out then to have quite a number of toxic properties, that it has been phased out. I'm old enough to have had mercury fillings. We don't do that anymore. A lot of uses of mercury now have been phased out because, although again a terrific substance, there are unintended impacts. And the chlorofluorocarbons, the CFCs, were phased out of aerosols because of issues with the ozone layer. And so a lot of these chemicals have they were introduced, they did a job, but it turned out they did other things that we didn't like so much, and we've phased them out to a large extent. But some of these things, it takes it could take 100 years for that phasing out to be complete. As regards then chemicals in general, there's a lot of legislation around the regulation of chemicals. So there's the registration, authorization, and certification of chemicals, the REACH legislation. There's this persistent organic pollutants registration, plant protection products, drinking water, and then the Water Framework Directive, which sets environmental quality standards for particular substances, and to take into account toxicology and human health. And so there are various different regulators in Ireland. The main regulator for chemicals under the REACH legislation is the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. The Department of Ag then are the regulator for plant protection products, and other legislation as well around food production. And then the EPA then has a role around the POPs regulations and the drinking water and the WFD. So what we're talking about here are chemicals that are persistent. They stick around for a long time. They bioaccumulate, in fish and shellfish and in humans, and they are toxic. So that's really what we're talking about. So I want to focus in a bit on monitoring in waters. So there's a lot of there's a good bit of monitoring that goes on, and a lot of research as well. We've seen Roshan's presentation, and there's a lot of other EPA-funded research that's been gone into this area over the last number of years. But the EPA aren't the only one operating monitoring programs looking at these chemicals. So the Uisce Éireann and the group water schemes. So we're aware there's an issue of pesticides, MCPA, in drinking water supplies and sources, and so a lot of work has gone on in the last number of years into try to eliminate these herbicides from the drinking water supplies, and also there's quite a lot of monitoring goes on in effluents from wastewater treatment plants as well. That Irish Water or Uisce Éireann do. But I want to focus in further then on our own monitoring program. So the EPA, we operate, as Pat mentioned there, the Water Framework Directive Priority Substances Monitoring Program. So that's where we look across all the rivers, lakes, estuaries and coastal waters in the country, and we carry out monitoring for these chemicals on a subset of that program. And we analyse for both, we analyse the actual water samples themselves, but we also analyse biota samples from those water bodies. So generally speaking, it's fish and trout mainly. And so as part of this program, there are 48 priority substances that have been assigned environmental quality standards under European and Irish regulations, and we do monitor for other substances of interest as well as part of that. And obviously the biota sampling is key, as was mentioned earlier, because these filter and it shows where there is bio accumulation. So again, the purpose, I suppose, that we use all this data for is, well, one of the uses is we use it then to assign chemical status to the water bodies that are on the monitoring program, and then we assign either a good chemical status, or else they have alternatively they fail to achieve good chemical status. So in last year's Water Quality in Ireland report, we published the results of the 2016-2021 monitoring, and as you can see there, in red are water bodies that failed to achieve good chemical status, and blue is ones that did. So on the face of it, maybe it's a bit surprising that maybe as many as half of the water bodies failed to achieve chemical status, and it's probably like we've learned a lot from our Scandinavian colleagues and other European colleagues about the occurrence of these substances in water. So it wasn't that surprising to us that these approximately half the water bodies that we monitored didn't fail to achieve good chemical status. But a lot of the reasons for these failures were, as I mentioned earlier, some of these chemicals that had been used were out there. They're ubiquitous is a word that means that they are out across the whole environment, and these are what I would call legacy chemicals. So you can see the main causes of failure of chemical status were PAHs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which caused 37% of the fails. The metals, mercury and a couple of other metals caused 26 or so of the water bodies to fail. and the polybrominated diphenyl ethers, which are flame retardants, that are coated onto plastics. They were responsible for about 19% of the failures. So that's quite a lot of the, about 3/4 or more of the failures were due to those three groups of chemicals. And the PAHs, I suppose it's interesting, their provenance, they're probably produced mainly as a result of inefficient combustion of fossil fuels, and also we heard about tires and astroturf pitches. These are all sources of PAHs. But I think the main source probably, and I think what we've learned, is that it's through the burning of fossil fuels and then transboundary precipitation, has resulted in PAHs being in all our surface waters, and in cases at concentrations above EQSs. And then mercury also has other uses, but it's also a pollutant that's associated with the burning of fossil fuels, and also natural events like volcanoes and things like that. But again, transboundary source is probably the main source of that in Irish waters. And then the PBDEs are probably interesting in that all these failures were in biota in fish samples, and that's probably from household goods and clothing and plastics, and these obviously are particularly bioaccumulative because we have found them in a lot of fish that were analysed. So these substances then have, just to a large extent, have been are in the process of being phased out. There's obviously we're trying to reduce fossil fuel burnings, but also there's more efficient furnaces and boilers. We're having more efficient and less produce of these PAHs. We're producing hopefully less mercury and cadmium, we realise, and the PBDs are being phased out as well. So I suppose we weren't that surprised that we found these failures, and it was for these legacy chemicals. But I suppose there are other chemicals then that, as we build up the evidence base in Irish waters and looking at what's happening in our cousins across Europe, the emerging pollutants then, things like the flame retardants and the polybrominated diphenyl ethers. I had them on the last slide, but things like perfluorinated compounds then, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, human pharmaceuticals, personal care products. These are all chemicals now that are coming on the radar and have been found elsewhere, and certainly are probably in our Irish waters as well. So we get them through the air, the water, the soil, through the microorganisms, the plants and the animals, and they all will have some impact then on humans. So I suppose, as I mentioned, I want to focus in on a couple of substances in particular. So as I mentioned, these per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, PFAS. So there's a huge family of these substances, and as I said, we started monitoring these in Irish waters in 2019, and about 10 of our water bodies, about 3% of the failures were due to these PFAS. So they're a large group of man-made chemicals being used in industry and consumer products since the 1950s, and they're used to repel in water and oil and thermal and chemical stability in our clothing and elsewhere. And they have surfactant properties, and you can see there's a fire fighting there. There's a fire extinguisher, and they are A huge source of them, as it turns out, are firefighting foam. So I'll show you something on that now in a minute. So we've, as I say, there's been failures in our monitoring program, but our colleagues in the chemical unit in the EPA have also been under the POPs regulations. They've been looking at PFAS and doing some investigations for point sources around the country of these chemicals. So as both our own monitoring program and some work that was done in follow-up by the chemicals unit in 2021 and 2022 looked in the River Shannon and the River Broadstone, where we were showing up some of these PFAS chemicals in the river, and indeed the Broadstone, there was quite a number of detections of PFOA, which is one of these compounds. There isn't actually an EQS associated with it, but it was interestingly found and in quite high concentrations. So our colleagues, we have been speaking with Westmeath County Council. There possibly is a point source, maybe associated with an old industry or something in the area, and so that's that's one thing. And another thing that was found by our colleagues is that looking in here on the left is they went looking at landfill leachate in some of the landfills around the country, and they looked at groundwater and surface waters around fire stations and airports, and they did find quite high concentrations of these chemicals, both in the leachate, which you might expect, but maybe worryingly around fire stations and airports, where there was a lot, I suppose, drills done or training with firefighting foams. So that has kind of fed in, that information has fed into our monitoring program. And the other chemical I want to talk a little bit about is cypermetrin, and I think a lot of us are aware of this. Again, we put it in the monitoring program in 2019, and again about 10 water bodies were failing due to this. It's an insecticide that was used. It was commonly used up until recently, where it's been phased out in agriculture and sheep dip and in forestry to control the pine weevil. It has low toxicity for mammals and birds, but invertebrates and fish are highly sensitive to cypermetrin, and it can be very damaging to aquatic ecosystems. So one of the this is in the last year's report. Some work we did, this is going back a couple of years ago now, is that our colleagues in the who are out assessing the ecological status of some of the rivers in Donegal. So the number of macroinvertebrate species being recorded in some of these rivers in Donegal was so greatly reduced that our colleagues suspected there was some sort of a toxic chemical effect. And so when we focused in and did a good bit of monitoring during 2020 in Donegal, and we've maintained some of these in the programme since, that the results showed a widespread detection of cypermetrin, with 26% of all the results showing levels above the environmental quality standard for cypermetrin, and in some cases the red and the purple there were multiple exceedances of the EQS. That's so I suppose then what's next? So I think I know we have a huge evidence base for N&P, and we spoke a lot about it here yesterday. We're still building the evidence base on these other chemicals that maybe we should be concerned about also. There is a big push from Europe on the EU Green Deal and Zero Pollution Action Plan, which is looking to phase out quicker or to stop the use of some of these chemicals. There's obviously a big push to, when we're designing these chemicals and managing them, that we try and anticipate if there are going to be unintended consequences and try and rule them out before they get produced. And also the EU, there's new legislation coming along with new priority substances. There's 24 candidate priority substances with environmental quality standards. Some of them are listed there. They're neonicotinoids, which affect or the bees. There's some other pyrethroids, which are cousins of cypermethrin. There's some hormones there, estradiols, antibiotics, and some painkillers there, and a suite of 24 PFAS chemicals. So, as I said, Joe, there are some, the PFAS and the cypermethrin. It may be that we can come up with some programs of measures in certain catchments that can help tackle the problems there. And Joe, we're going to need more screening for these new substances and more targeted monitoring of all these priority substances. So I hope I didn't frighten you too much with that, but that's what I have to say to you this morning. Thank you.